Okay, let's see how this works. So, it is actually an opinion I've heard before from people, or like an experience that Bendy doesn't really scare them either. And I'm curious about why that is. Because I wonder, like, is it just the real world thing? I don't know. And that's that's like a genuine question. I'm not sure. I'm I don't know, but it's something I would like to learn more about. And what I can say, like, from my own perspective, is that although Bendy does not scare me one bit, Poppy Playtime absolutely does. Like, if I see it in like a thumbnail accidentally, I have to look away. I can't do it. But in this case, like me not being able to look at it, usually you go like, man, that's kind of rude. But here, I actually think that's a huge compliment. I think the stream, yeah. If this for some reason didn't start until about a minute ago on my end, it started sooner. I don't know what happened, but basically I'm going over mascot horror, why I think it works so well, which is it's tapping into the uncomfortability of something being friendly, being turned dangerous, and where I think that works well versus where I think it doesn't. At least in my personal experience, Bendy isn't very scary, but Poppy Playtime is. And I want to talk about like my personal experience for like why I think that is and discuss how it might be affecting other people. So a lot of the textures in Bendy just kind of look the same. Like if I'm looking at the ink monsters, they don't look real. And I can see a point to that. Like making them look kind of alien would help them look scary, or maybe it would help sell that they're made of ink. But in my personal experience, like I look at them and I go like, "Oh, that's not dangerous. That's just a cartoon character." Even when it's doing something scary like chasing after the player character. And a lot of like the backgrounds don't look particularly realistic either. And again, you don't have to do realism. Like that's not something you have to do everywhere. But I think making some things more grounded in reality could have made it feel more real and sharper, less like, a fantasy. If there's that kind of mental barrier there, for me personally, that helps me remember, like, that's not real. So then I don't feel scared of it. Versus in Poppy Playtime, have you seen the material definition? I remember like first seeing Huggy Wuggy out of the corner of my eye. Never a good place to see Huggy Wuggy. Like his lips are super shiny. They look like plastic or resin. And then the fur looks like individual furs. It's shiny. It looks soft. I can tell like this is a toy and this part would be soft. This part would be shiny like plastic. And I think that helps it feel more real because I look at it and I go like, I know how that would feel in real life. I recognize that. Plus, the lighting, I clearly remember first seeing the lighting like bouncing off of his lips. They looked like shiny. So obviously that helps it look more like plastic, but that also makes me think of like when a wild animal is really, really hungry, it's drooling, which is kind of what it's like being chased by Huggy Wuggy, sort of, especially with the teeth. I think that's something that Poppy Playtime does well, and I'm not sure if this was intentional, but to me, it makes me think of the primal fear of being like eaten. That's something humans have had to worry about as long as there have been humans. Like the toys are running out of food, so no wonder they're chasing after us. But I am curious about why that is. I don't think that's been explained lore-wise yet, and depending on how you explain it, I think it could be very one note, like it's just the fear of being eaten, or you could do something where it doesn't make sense biologically, and yet they still feel, like, compelled to do it, like, they're toys, presumably they don't really need nutrients, but they still wanna do it, and you could go into, like, maybe it's magic, maybe it's something we don't understand, like in cosmic horror. Mm, I don't know if this is called the same thing in gaming, but the way the movements of the monsters work, that also really gets me. Like, where he's just, like, swaying behind you a little bit, that is terrifying. Another thing that gets me in the real world context of it is, like, the lack of safety precautions in a toy factory. A bunch of kids being experimented on in a toy factory, like, that's not good. All that stuff has analogs in real life. I wonder if the choice of poppies was because they're known to have, like, hallucinogenic effects, and so people kind of associate them with, like, fantasy. I think that'll probably mean something a lot more as we continue on, but we don't know so far. Obviously, another reason this is scary is it's toys, and obviously that's something that's supposed to be, like, friendly and safe, it's in the name, it's playtime. But if you take that and you make it scary, that's scary. That's a big dissonance, especially if it's, like, kids that are getting hurt. At least for me, that's a lot. That's really, really scary. So, I think that makes it really effective, especially I think something that adds to this dissonance is where they mostly look like a toy. And they look familiar, like I was saying about the fur and the plastic, but then they have things like really sharp teeth or blood. And you're like, well, that's not supposed to come from a toy. Those belong to organic beings. What's going on here? And that makes it feel more visceral, of the guts, it's a Latin word. And I think that's because we're humans. A lot of us will look at like the blood or the fur, and we don't have that much fur anymore, but we'll be like, I have that stuff too. That could happen to me. And it's it's curious that there's all this biological stuff happening, but then there's the prototype, which is something we typically use for machines. What is that going to mean? Another thing that I wonder if it went into this game was like evolutionary stuff. The idea of the prototype being this like super intelligent creature that nobody really understands, I wonder if that's how like some animals saw humans. We're just really, really smart, even when the rest of the animals seem pretty normal. I did make a list of everything I wanted to talk about, so let me check on that and make sure I have it all written up. Mhm. I do think I think it's interesting that at least many people have described not being scared of Bendy, but I've also seen lots of people like be very, very scared by Poppy Playtime. And I wonder if that says something about how they're different because they have a lot in common. They both have little recordings that you can listen to, and that tells you about what's happening in the story, that tells you about the lore, that helps you fill in the gaps. It's something I like. It reminds me of putting a puzzle together or watching a photo develop. You learn a little bit at a time, and overall, you start to understand the whole picture of what's happening. And that plus the Christian imagery, plus it probably owes the overall aesthetic more to FNAF. But a lot of those little things remind me a lot of Bendy. And I wonder if it's possible that even if all of the chapters weren't out yet, if the people making Poppy Playtime were like playing Bendy or observing it in the wild and they were like, well, I really like this idea, but I would do this differently. I would make this stronger. I would I would like I would differentiate the textures here. I would make the lighting more realistic. Rendering is crazy, by the way. I genuinely want to know how they did all this. And I wonder if that's kind of how we got Poppy Playtime is someone looking at what had been done before in this genre and going, okay, how would I change it? Or what do I think could make it stronger? Because that's good. That's that's like evolution too. That's people looking at the things that they like or are inspired by and thinking critically about them. Like, where does this succeed? Where does this not succeed? I remember first learning about the guy that made FNAF, whose name escapes me right now. He would like show the jump scares to his kids and be like, "Is this too scary?" And they would say no. And I struggle to understand that. Maybe they're stronger than me, but it also reminds me of when the book Coraline was being written. The author wanted to know if it was too scary, so the editor shows it to her daughter, right? And she's like, "Daughter, was that too scary for you?" Now, the daughter actually was quite scared, but she wanted to know how the story would end, so she said, "No." So, yeah, if you've ever been scared by Coraline, there's a good reason for that. It is too scary for kids, but it exists because a child lied to their parent. And sometimes I kind of like jokingly wonder if that's what happened with FNAF. I forgot until recently just how many books there are connected to it too, and I cannot keep up with all that. I have a general idea of what happens, but I'm not like a FNAF lore expert. Luckily, there are plenty of 50-minute video essays on it. And I do think that not all of this was planned from the beginning. I get like the overall idea of, these animatronics is supposed to be cute, but they end up being scary. What if we leaned into that? I think that was probably the overarching idea, and then it just kept expanding into 17 games, the movie, endless merch, and I wonder if that's why it doesn't like not every game feels like the same level of quality to me, at least from like a storytelling perspective. That's what I can critique well. Some of them feel a lot weaker. And I wonder if that's because the initial idea was the gameplay, you're the night guard. You have to keep an eye on all these creatures. And it almost reminds me of being like a wildlife observer. I wonder if that was an inspiration. Like the the bare bones concept came first and then everything else. And I don't know if story was like a priority initially, but that's the kind of thing where it can help to plan that out from the beginning. Thinking of how to phrase this. I'm really curious if mascot horror has affected other genres too. Like in regular horror, is there more of a focus now on like making something look friendly, at least initially? I don't really enjoy it, but I'm curious if there's like people who do like watching horror movies, for example. Have they seen like things change in recent years? Speaking of FNAF merch, I remember when I first heard in Poppy Playtime about that curious bear that produces slime, and at the time I was like, "Haha, funny gag." Maybe that's like poking fun at the ubiquitousness of FNAF merch. I didn't think it was real, guys. I didn't think I was foolish. I didn't think someone would see two money-making things, which are slime and FNAF, and put them together. Because let me tell you, how they were put together was not good. Reminds me of when you have like two foods that you really like like I don't know, chocolate and like guacamole. But if you put those two things together, sometimes they're bad. And this is an example of that. Like I, as an adult, am frightened by FNAF, and that's an experience I've seen from other players too, especially for the second game. Like you can be a fully grown adult and this would still scare you. So I'm like, are some kids just built different? Or did they lie? It feels bad to accuse someone of lying. I just wanna know why this happened. I didn't use to consider it, like, I don't think I would like to read it, but I wonder if it would be fun to write something that's intentionally meant to be scary. And I feel like there's a lot to discuss where you really enjoy something that is meant to scare you. So, like, although normally being scared would probably be a bad thing, here you're like, "Oh, good, it's doing its job," or "Wow, that was really well done." I wonder if there's like a mascot people haven't used already. Because Bendy, like, kind of did the whole Disney theme park thing, but that wasn't really the focus. Or like, there's stuffed animals, but I wonder if those count as like a sub-variety of toy, you know? Speaking of which, it is really interesting how there's like there's blood, there's fur, there's skin, there's clearly organs within these toys, but then the prototype, at least that we've seen of it so far, it looks skeletal and it's not even organic. It's made of metal. That's a very interesting contrast. And I wonder if that's intentional. Something else I really want to praise this series for, and this does also go for Bendy, at least in the 2D art, is it really nails the aesthetic it's going for. Like, if you've seen the 2D key art of the toys, like, obviously there's Huggy Wuggy, there's Kissy Missy, but even if you look at like the cat whose name escapes me right now, it looks like toy packaging I've seen from the 80s, for example. Very flat colors, very line weight, lots of pastels. There's even like little markings on some of the toys that remind me of like cutie marks in My Little Pony. And that is not easy. Even in like the 3D models, making something look like fur and not just specifically like wild fur. It looks like the polyester super soft fur that you get on real life plushes. That's not easy. That is not easy to do. Like showing each of those individual hairs and lighting them all correctly and but also controlling the lighting so it doesn't get distracting. That is not easy. That is very, very difficult. So it's very impressive to see. Some and speaking of lighting, when I talk about the lighting realistic, in this case it works, but I wouldn't say worry about it all the time for everything that you make because like in real life, sometimes the lighting can be really bad, like on a really sunny day. Maybe there's light glaring everywhere and you can barely see what you're looking at. If you're writing a story and like you're trying to show this really sunny day in a video game, for example, turn the glare down. Make sure you can see what's happening. Don't pull a Game of Thrones and have an entire episode shot in like complete darkness. This is a story. We need to be able to see what's happening. Did you see the smiling critters with those completely black eyes, by the way? I would never buy those for my kid. And I wonder if that's just to keep up the, you're supposed to remember that this is a horror game, but I wonder if there's a balance we can strike there because it reminds me of the puppet in FNAF. She does not look friendly. If I went to like a Chuck E. Cheese and I saw that thing, I would run away screaming. Like she looks a little like a mosquito with the stripy arms, but more importantly, she's got noodle limbs, she's got tears painted on her face, which looks like a mask. She looks like some kind of horrifying nightmare creature. And that doesn't really fit with her initially being created to like hand out little toys or tickets or whatever it was. I haven't checked in a minute. Like with a mascot, you want them to look friendly because they're trying to appeal to kids. So I don't fully understand why she looks like that. I don't see what the reason is right now. I do wonder if it was intentional that I'm having a really hard time with names today. What's her name? Yeah, Mommy Longlegs. I wonder if it's intentional that she's like bright pink. She's got really stretchy limbs and she's voiced by Sarah Stiles. She reminds me of another character. I just can't think of who. Hmm. Speaking of little bits of dissonance in this game, the titular Poppy, I really like how she mostly looks like a normal doll, but if you look at her eyes, they've got like little veins. They look bloodshot. They look like very real organic eyes. And because this is a toy where you would normally expect like plastic or porcelain, that's weird. That makes you go, well, why does she look like that? Is she organic in there? Considering she's had her voice box removed, but it's got blood on it, what's happening? Like that feels weird. And it's supposed to, in this case, it's supposed to scare you. So I hope if there's an explanation for that, it's this is a little hard to articulate, but I hope it's something like we don't know. This just happens. Because mysteries can keep people guessing. They can be harder to deal with than an answer because with an answer, a lot of times it gives you control. Like if it was like, oh, it was this very specific magic spell, then you can go, okay, just break the spell. But if you have something that's like, we don't know what it is, and no matter how hard we try, we can't understand it, that's frustrating. What do you do about it? It's really hard. I really hope that if we find out why the toys are organic and how people were like transmuted into them somehow, I hope it's not a really simple answer, like, oh, we just put the brain into the toy, because there's probably a way you could make that work if you had like magic involved, but some of them are like really small. I don't think there's any way that would work in real life. And this is another thing that reminds me a bit of the hauntings from FNAF, which probably had something to do with the ink machine. And in FNAF, it's ghosts, it's hauntings. That's something everybody's familiar with. And like that's an easy hook. That makes sense. But I'm not sure if that's what's happening in Poppy Playtime because that's not how it's been presented so far. Again, things feel more organic, they're visceral. And I wonder if this will have something to do with like the heart, like the physical heart in the body. And because it's in the name, I'm pretty sure poppies are going to have something to do with it. Maybe like you hallucinate becoming a toy, only it's for real. It's something I'm very curious about, and I hope it's done well. Oh, maybe you could have magic, but play it like this thing humans don't understand. Like it's here, we messed with it, and as you can see, it's caused a lot of problems, way more than it solved. It's also interesting how all three of these games have a very specific time period in the real world. Like we can infer from things happening in the 90s and the game happens 10 years later, we can infer that Poppy Playtime takes place around 2005. But the company has existed since around the 1930s, and that gives you kind of a real life benchmark. You can compare what was happening in the game to what was happening outside of it. And depending on how you use it, that could be really cool. I'm just curious, like, what's the purpose of that right now? Like, are you going to say something about the time period that you're in? Maybe you could talk about how like safety precautions used to be way worse, and like we need to have them because they keep people safe. Or maybe there's just a context I personally am missing here. Like, is there some kind of purpose to the game taking place in 2005? Like, is this what toys looked like at the time? What was going on at the time? Are we trying to make a statement about that? I genuinely don't know. Well, I know some of the video games that came out that year, but I haven't seen anything in this game so far that reminds me of them. In FNAF, for example, things take place in the 80s, 90s, because that's when these kinds of they've got to have a name. When Chuck E. Cheese type places were popular, that makes total sense. That's obviously not when everything happens, but that helps give the series a time frame. You go, oh, that's why people were building these animatronics. That was what people were doing at the time. That was trendy. And in Bendy, a lot of the game's backstory happens in the first half of the 20th century. And what's always been interesting to me is that the game doesn't actually happen until 30 years after that. So it's actually taking place in more like the 1970s. And I don't think that's ever been explored, but maybe that's something you could make a statement about too. Like things have changed in the last 30 years. Like I like some of these changes. Like like women had slightly more rights, for example. But like things like happened to Alice still happen 30 years later. You could talk about that and maybe you could go like, well, we shouldn't be in a time loop. We should be in the real world and make positive changes. You know? It is crazy to see just how many people make songs for these games and like people covering them and people just like creating things to show that they appreciate it. It's really cool. I think it was the music video for the Toy Box, the Stupendium song, which was where I first encountered Poppy Playtime. I was like, I can't look at this. I'm going to listen to the music. I can't look at the screen. But again, here, that's a compliment. It means it's scary. It means it's doing its job. It's really cool to see the Stupendium help be a part of this franchise too. I've been listening to them since a little while after Bendy first got really popular, and it's crazy to see how much things have changed in that time. Again, I'm curious, what was the reason for making little Bendy a demon? Hmm? I don't know. Maybe that's been explained and I just missed it, but like, is there trying to be a message about like praying to somebody, but they're a demon? Like everybody in the studio, well, you get the idea. Some people in the studio were like, Bendy's so cool. We'll pray to this man, but he's very obviously a demon. He's not a good guy. He's got the horns on his head. It's right there. Maybe you could say something about how like people really look up to somebody, like, but that person isn't always good. Like, I would compare him to Joey Drew in that case. Everybody looks up to him. They think he's this cool guy. He is not. That would be an intentional parallel I used, but I'm not sure if that was intended. Okay, that should be everything I wanted to cover today. So just as like a wrap up, I have an interesting relationship with mascot horror where I don't enjoy it, but I appreciate it. I appreciate that it's like in many cases it's very good at being scary. It has a very unique and potent way of being scary. It taps into something that we're trained to think of as safe and makes that thing not safe. So that's something I think is really interesting. And although I don't love like watching it all the time because of how it works, I think it's very interesting to analyze and see what it does well versus what it doesn't do well. Which in this case, making something look less real made it less scary and making it feel a bit more grounded in reality, even if it is fantastical, in real life. I don't think anyone's haunting toys, but adding some of those real world touches helped me feel more connected to it and more scared by it, which made it work better. And I'm also just very interested in how mascot horror has affected the horror genre overall, and how games like FNAF probably didn't create, but popularized this whole idea. That's I think is very interesting, and it's something that I want to keep looking into. And overall, just because you don't like something doesn't mean it's bad. In some cases, you not liking something means it's good. It's doing its job, and that's the case here.